Today's a hard day. When I first became a Christian, I was very confused by what the communion of saints in the Apostles' Creed meant, because it seemed illogical to be taking communion with dead people. As a literal person, it just didn't fly. But today that we recognize on this All Saints Sunday that we are spiritually united in one body, not just with other living Christians who are here in this church, but also united with Christians who have passed away. It's a day to reflect that there are people who are gone who made big impacts in our spiritual lives, in our own faith journeys, and it's a day that we think about just loved ones being gone. And that often means for many it is a day that's filled with grief. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today actually came from a devotional that I wrote called Sitting in Grief, a devotional journey towards standing again. It's something that I wrote a couple months after my dad had suffered a tragic accident and passed away shortly after COVID began. By that time, his death was just kind of another in just a long string of deaths. It is. My mom had passed away before that. A couple days ago was just the 10-year anniversary of my son dying. So before I was 40, I experienced what felt like a lifetime of grief and found myself with the realization that my entire family is now gone. And I'm the only one left standing. So today we're going to talk about three things. One, emotions, right? There's a lot of emotions that are brought up. We're going to talk about what to say to people who are grieving. And we're going to talk about ways of moving forward when it feels like grief is holding you back. Emotions can be complicated for Christians to navigate, especially when we're grieving. Some of us were taught that emotions are dangerous and that they need to be controlled or suppressed. And you kind of hear verses like Jeremiah 17:9, which I think are probably a little out of context, but says, "The heart is deceitful above all things." And I've watched people stoically try to push their grief because they thought that's just what good Christians do. I've seen prominent Christian pastors who just lost their son say that they weren't sad about their son dying because they're in heaven now. They later came to regret saying that. Because trying to suppress your grief doesn't make it go away. It just buries it, or it does more damage. Here's what I've learned: that emotions need to be felt. They need to be recognized, but not every emotion is worth holding on to after it's been experienced. Grief is not a destination. It is a holy process, and it is not something that can be rushed. If you've ever lost someone close to you, you likely know what it means to feel all these emotions at once at the same time. In fact, just earlier in worship today, we were lighting these candles in memory of the saints and go into this very joyful Kyrie right after, and it felt jarring to me. But that's what it's like. You feel everything all at once. But we serve a God who has intimate knowledge of what it's like to love and to lose. When his friend Lazarus died, what did Jesus do? Say he wept, but that translation may actually be a little like someone was trying to shield that Jesus actually broke down crying. He was sad. He mourned with Mary and Martha, even though Jesus knew that he was going to bring Lazarus back from the dead. Even though he knew this separation was only temporary, he still fully experienced that sadness. Jesus shows us that it's not only okay to feel our grief, but it's holy. Grief is holy because it's the evidence of love. It's holy because in our deepest pain, when we're most aware of our need for God, it's holy because, like Jesus at Lazarus' tomb, our tears acknowledge the profound wrongness of death and God's good creation. And when we grieve, we join our sorrow with God's own heart that weeps at the brokenness of this world. And that's why grief isn't something to rush through or put aside. It's a sacred space where we meet God in our deepest vulnerability. I'm going to pause for a second. Does anybody have a tissue I could borrow real quick?
Right over there, there's a box.
Thanks. Jesus cried, and so can I.
Anyone else? Keep them handy.
Thanks. After we lost our son, my wife and I needed some time. She needed to physically heal from the emergency C-section that she went through, and we both needed a lot of time to heal emotionally. On our first venture out, we went to a Tim Hortons. We were living in the Bible Belt of Western New York, in a small town. And if you've ever lived in a small town, you may know, if you've ever been kind of near a public figure, lots of people know who you are, even though you don't necessarily know who everyone is. So, at our first time out at Tim Hortons, there was a family who knew us, who we didn't know, a Catholic family, and for some reason, they thought that seeing us would be an appropriate time to have a loud discussion about whether our son was burning in hell because he hadn't been baptized. Their words cut deep, not just because they were cruel, but because they missed what God teaches us about responding to grief. Because when Jesus came to Mary and Martha after Lazarus has died, notice what he didn't do. He didn't lecture them about theology. He didn't tell them to stop crying because they're in a better place. Instead, Jesus just wept with them. The creator of the universe showed us exactly how to be present when someone is grieving. Just simply be there and share their sorrow. But unfortunately, most of us aren't very good at following Jesus' example. You probably didn't have anyone saying what someone said to us. But you probably heard people who mean well say things that really weren't helpful to you. Like, oh, heaven needed another angel. Or in the landlord's case, for me, think of all the fun you'll have trying again. But here's the thing, these are people who genuinely care. They're just uncomfortable with grief, and they try to fix things with words. But grief isn't something to be fixed. It's something to be experienced, as Jesus showed us. So if you ever find yourself with someone who's grieving, just remember Jesus at Lazarus' tomb. Don't try to take their pain away. Just be there. Cry with them. Sit in uncomfortable silence. Just be there and be sad with them. Because the process of grief requires us to be gentle with ourselves first. Much like Jesus, who occasionally withdrew to quiet places to pray after especially difficult moments. Yet we can't stay withdrawn forever. Martin Luther described this danger of being incurvatus and say, turned in on yourself. And in grief, it becomes very easy to be so focused on your own pain that we forget why we're called to be here, to love God and to love others. When we're ready, and only when we're ready, turning our attention outwards from our own pain can be part of our healing process. Because every time I've been through the grieving process, looking back, I see how God brought unexpected life from death. When my dad passed away, I felt completely alone as the last person standing in my family. But God used that grief to help others. And that devotional I wrote in fairly dark days that I wrote really is something for me to process. Has now had over 40,000 people read it. And every day I get multiple emails in my inbox of people telling me what a comfort that plan was for them and sharing their grief stories about what they're going through right now. That work actually has inspired me to become a certified grief recovery specialist. And what felt like an ending has actually become a new beginning for me in many ways. And when Jesus died, that death on the cross, nobody fully grasped what was going on at the time, because after Jesus' death, the apostles' emotions in those dark days and hours were incredibly raw and powerful. They experienced just profound psychological pain and spiritual turmoil. Their reactions show them as deeply human figures grappling with a traumatic loss and shattered expectations. If you had asked them what good was going to come from Jesus' death, I'm quite sure you would have gotten a resounding nothing at all. Because you can't ask a person grieving to look past their own pain. But we worship a God who specializes in bringing life from death, hope from despair, and meaning from meaninglessness. What looked like defeat to those grieving disciples was actually the greatest victory in all of history, the moments when death itself was defeated. The cross that seemed to represent the end of their dreams was actually the doorway to something far greater than they could have ever imagined. Through Jesus' resurrection, God wasn't just fixing what was broken, God was making all things new. And those disciples who had been paralyzed by grief became bold proclaimers of hope. And the same ones who had been behind the locked doors burst forth to tell the world that death had lost its sting, that the tomb that held their buried hopes had become the birthplace of eternal hope. And as God proved that every ending in God's hands can become a new beginning. So on this All Saints' Day, as we remember those who we've lost and feel the weight of their absence, just remember this: God doesn't just understand our grief. God sits in it with us, just as Jesus wept for Mary and Martha. And right now, we might be like those first disciples in their darkest hours, unable to see past our pain, feeling like nothing good can ever come from the loss that we feel. But the same God who turned the disciples' grief into the foundation of our faith, who transformed a cross of death into the symbol of eternal life, is still at work today. God doesn't ask us to rush through our grief or pretend that we're not hurting. Instead, God invites us to bring every raw emotion, every tear, every moment of anger, of confusion, of frustration and despair, and lay them at the foot of the cross. Because while grief is not our final destination, it is sacred ground. It is a holy process where God can take our sorrows and in God's time transform them into unexpected blessings. The tomb is never the end of God's story. The same God who rolled away the stone that first Easter morning is still in the business of rolling stones away, showing us again and again that no grave, physical or emotional, can hold what God has promised to redeem. Amen.